781 M31. 5 centuries had passed since the bitter end of the Horus Heresy, and from the shadows of the Eye of Terror, a black tide surged forth. Its architect, Abaddon the Despoiler, once the first captain of the Luna Wolves, now self-proclaimed War Master of Chaos Undivided. This would mark the beginning of the first of the Black Crusades. At the helm of this newly formed Black Legion was Abaddon, as he launched a brutal offensive against the Imperium of Man. His target was the Cadian Gate, the only stable route bridging the warp-choked Eye of Terror and the material universe. But Cadia held, towering bastions and unwavering resolve from the Cadian shock troopers staved off the initial assault, denying Chaos a clear passage to the throne of the false emperor. But this invasion, this first Black Crusade, was much more than a test of arms. It was a declaration. What few records survive from the period suggest that Abaddon's motives were layered in ambition and retribution. During the campaign, Abaddon ventured to Ulran, a world of shrieking ruins and psychic echoes. There, deep within the labyrinthian passageways sealed by unknown Xenos wards, he claimed the demon sword Drachnaian. This ancient weapon was a relic bound to a warp entity of unspeakable power that had languished in stasis ever since it was taken by Ra and Demion into the depths of the webway. Once it was in Abaddon's hands, the weapon's howling presence signaled the awakening of something far worse than a warlord. This was the birth of a herald of true annihilation. With Drachnaian bound to his will, Abaddon's influence grew steadily at an almost geometric rate. What followed was not just an invasion, it was a spectacle of cruelty, true artistry in atrocity. Zargothian the Broken, a name now synonymous with horror, led his warband to the agri-world of Valessa. Amidst the blood-rose orchards, Zargothian reshaped the flora into a massive, vast, nigh unending maze of thorns. His prisoners, blinded and stripped of all dignity, were loosed within these vast death trap. One by one they were hunted down, while the scent of blood roses filled their shredded lungs. These screams, recorded in garbled vox logs, recovered later by Adeptus Mechanicus salvage teams, painted a portrait of sadism with no mortal equal. Elsewhere, the Raptor commander, Elrak, descended down on the floating cities of Mifa, in a campaign that would have redefined terror if it were not for the previous, as he sabotaged their suspensor arrays, sending the cities plummeting to the soil of the planet below. And from the wreckage, Elrak raised immense gallows hanging millions of corpses who drift endlessly across the upper skies, a veritable floating warning made visible for all to see. But despite these atrocities, perhaps the most disturbing feature of the First Black Crusade was its unprecedented unity. For the first time since the Heresy, the rival traitor legions, each one steeped in their own corruption, disdainful of all others, stood together under a single banner. Even demons deferred, albeit begrudgingly, to the authority of the Black Legion. That this cohesion lasted only as long as Imperial resistance did is surprising. But during the height of this conflict, the unthinkable occurred: cooperation amongst the damned. That, more than any massacre, heralded the arrival of a new age of chaos. The Imperium, still reeling from its wounds after this scouring, could only brace for what would come next. The Imperium would then dub these recurring assaults as Black Crusades, a name etched into every page of history by fire and madness. Abaddon's legions would pour from the Eye of Terror again and again and again, each time with greater force, devastating entire sectors and enslaving entire populations, leaving naught but ruination in their wake. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they would vanish back into the void. Throughout Segmentum Obscurus and increasingly far beyond, this cycle of invasion and devastation, followed by withdrawal, became the black rhythm of the Long War. And in each of these forays, Abaddon would make his point. He was not Horus. He would not fail. Eventually, the crusade would end, but the true war, the Long War, had only begun. The next event of galactic import that the Black Legion would take part in occurred in 027 M32. This would be when Fenrock, the Forgotten, a commander within the Black Legion, would stumble upon a world of singularly cursed potential. Comprised almost entirely of warp-tainted iron ore, the planet promised an immense value, but at a cost. Its minerals drove mortal slaves mad or mutated them beyond recognition at a rate too quickly to efficiently process. Some veins even secreted a corrosive substance that liquefied flesh and machinery alike. Seeking a grim solution, Fenrock performed a rite of mass sacrifice, binding warp entities into his mining machines, and this would result in constructs that were part demon, part automaton, allowing them to tear into the planet's mineral veins with merciless efficiency. The mortal workforce itself was expendable by design, so it was reduced to ash and their names forgotten. This would allow the Black Legion to have a significantly better stock of cursed and tainted weapons. The next incident of galactic import would occur in 597 M32. Up next would be the Second Black Crusade. Abaddon's return in the Second Black Crusade struck the Bellis Corna sector with a silent fury. Instead of claiming territory or even setting up encampments for a longer protracted struggle, the Despoiler placed a lingering curse across its worlds, infusing their biospheres, atmospheres, and the very soil of the planets with the corruptive touch of the imperium. Simultaneously, his fleets devastated imperial shipyards, destroying dozens of cruisers in various stages of construction and repair. While the imperium scrambled to rally a counteroffensive, Abaddon enacted a broader stratagem. Entrusting the vengeful spirit to his sorcerers, he teleported to the Nemesis Teresa, a fortified inquisitorial bastion. There he melted down the hexagrammic eldritch needles designed to ward against psychic intrusion, reducing them to slag with a continuous and sustained meltafire. The Inquisition would later discover that their secured vault had been breached, and its occupant, a demon whose name was erased from most records, was now gone. The fortress that had been meticulously designed, crafted, and built to contain that very entity had proven useless in said task, as it was now free. And this all occurred in 597 M32. Later, at an unknown date during M32, it would be Durkarth the Sightless who would organize the dissenting Sons of Horus into a warband known as Sons of the Eye. Refusing to bear Abaddon's banner, Drekarth carved his own legend during the Battle of the Keening Deep. Facing the berserkers of Vol's World Eaters, Drekarth's forces emerged victorious in a duel amidst fire and ruin. Drekarth tore Volker's demon axe from his grip and slew him with his own blade. The fallen skulls of the World Eaters were then cast into the soul fires that burned beneath the planet's crust, in an act equal parts triumph and ritual. The next incident of galactic import that would occur involving the Black Legion would be the Third Black Crusade, which occurred in 909 M32. And it was during the Third Black Crusade that Abaddon unleashed the demon prince known as Ptolemy upon the Cadian Gate in a furious and reckless frontal assault. The carnage itself left millions dead, forcing the Imperium to divert forces from across the Segmentum Obscurus. Eventually, it would be the Space Wolves who cast Ptolemy back into the Immaterium, but the true intent had been a misdirection. While the Imperium had bled, Abaddon desecrated the shrine world of Jersel, smashing the crypt of its sacred protector. The remnants of the Imperial Saint would then be obliterated, nullifying the prophecy of his return and permanently weakening the world's psychic bulwark. The next event would occur in the maddening depths of the Eye of Terror, where the Thousand-Sun sorcerer Zarfston journeyed to seek the favor of Tzeentch. There, amidst the shifting labyrinths, Zeraphon was granted visions of aeons to come. With a soul heavy with knowledge and a heart blackened by ambition, he would pledge himself to Abaddon, offering prophecy and counsel in exchange for a seat at the Despoiler's side. Then, in 001 M34, the Fourth Black Crusade would occur, known in military records as the Elfror War, and this crusade centered on the siege of the citadel of Komarash. The fortress, reigned in adamantium and long thought impregnable, faced the full fury of Abaddon's wrath. Only 1 in 10 of the initial assault survived the advance under heavy and relentless bolter fire. Yet Abaddon himself reached the gates, wielding the demon sword Draconian, and he split them asunder with a single cleaving blow. What followed next was a massacre. The defenders themselves would be annihilated, and the noble line of Karmrock would be extinguished beneath claw, bolt, and blade. Later, on the world of Heliasun, in the Asparinga sector, the warlord Zegranth the Broken enacted a ritual of sickening blasphemy, capturing the sisters of the Covenant of the Alabaster Maidens, and he subjected them to long-lasting stints of warp exposure until their latent psychic abilities erupted from them uncontrollably. Using arcane technology, he fused the sisters together into a singular, monstrous entity, a veritable living gateway through which demons could pour out into the material realm. Later still, the Talon of Rage, a vessel of the Black Legion, would emerge, and quickly be destroyed in orbit above the feral world of Skaro, leaving only 1 legionary alive. Descending upon the surface, where he was mistaken for god, over time the primitive population of Suro formed a chaos cult around him, calling him the Ragged King. His influence would spread like wildfire, corrupting the entire biosphere and culture. It would take over a decade of planetary warfare for the Imperial Guard to reclaim the world and extinguish his nascent heresy. Then, in 723 M36, the 5th Black Crusade would occur, and it bore the unmistakable signature of a calculated series of destruction, devastation, and annihilation. In the Elisa sector, Abaddon ordered the systematic destruction of specific religious and strategic sites across a dozen worlds. These sacrilegious acts shattered warp seals that had kept local mutations in check for generations. On Tebeth, he lured the Warhawks and the Venators, Space Marine chapters, into the ruins of Kaiser Luthen. There he sprung a trap, unleashing both the Black Legion along with a demonic host of Khorne. Neither chapter would survive. Their skulls were taken by the demon prince Doombreed in the grim tithe to the Lord of Skulls. In the waning centuries of the 36th millennium and the blood-soaked rise of the 37th, Abaddon the Despoiler carved a path in broken oaths and shattered allegiances. It is within this epoch of carnage that we find the shadowplay of betrayal, ambition, and retribution that defined the 6th and 7th Black Crusades, and the near-forgotten clues of what was to come that they left behind. In 901 M36 began a campaign of annihilation that ended as a warning. The Sons of the Eye, a warband formed by Chaos Lord Descartes the Sightless, once a loyal son of Horus and comrade-in-arms to Abaddon the Despoiler himself, stood defiantly against the Despoiler's growing claims as the War Master of Chaos. Descartes, known to history as the Blind Butcher of Iridius 7, had long bore envy and resentment towards the favor Horus had showered Abaddon with. That grudge festered into a blooming rebellion. During the campaign for the Forge World of Arcreach, the Despoiler joined forces with Drakarth's warband, fighting alongside them shoulder to shoulder until the Forge's defenders were utterly annihilated. Yet his alliance was merely a facade. As victory was claimed, Abaddon turned on Drakarth with the calculated cruelty Abaddon the Despoiler had become known for. He impaled the blind warlord with a Talon of Horus, forcing him to watch unblinkingly as his Sons of the Eye bent the knee to their true master. In that moment, the message was etched into the records of the Eye of Terror. Defiance against the Despoiler carries a price far greater than death. Later, the Anti-Canes massacre would occur in 165 M37, and we would see the Black Legion fight alongside other Chaos Space Marine warbands, chief amongst them the Purge. The details of this atrocity remain highly classified, but the scale of the devastation suggests a coordinated annihilation rather than a mere opportunistic series of engagements. Little is said about how or why this atrocity was allowed to escalate, only that it did, and that the Black Legion played its part with surgical precision. In the absence of a clear external enemy, Abaddon turned inward. The Tournament of Blood would occur sometime after this event, in M37, and it serves as both spectacle and sacrifice, as 8 solar days of pit fighting within the gore-drenched holds of the vengeful spirit ended with the sole survivor being impaled upon the talon of Horus. The despoiler in this moment enacted a blood pact with Khorne himself, earning the loyalty of the greater demon Hak-Angrath. Whether this was done to earn favor or to purge weakness from amongst his chosen is uncertain. However, what is certain is that it definitely took a toll, and there was a price to be paid in the overall strength of his forces for a while, as even darker methods were employed during the Prison of Madness. However, there's no records of a specific location or time. The operation itself remains highly classified and mostly reconstructed through secondary testimony. Captured loyalist Astartes were apparently subjected to perpetual harrowing visions and prophecies of the Imperium's fall, shown again and again and again ad infinitum. Many would go about and terminate their own lives. The rest, hollowed of belief and brotherhood, turned to Abaddon in abject surrender. However, many within the Imperium still ask, were these visions illusions, or were they truths not yet realized? Potential paths history could take. Then, in 811 M37, the 7th Black Crusade, better known as the Ghost War, was unleashed. Emerging from the Eye of Terror, the Black Legion moved well past Cadia, then vanished. What followed was not a campaign, but rather a phantom plague of raids, feints, and misinformation. As planets fell without a known attacker, fleets chased shadows, and the Imperium's defenses remained largely intact, but the cost was rather substantial in morale and stability, as the damage done on the backlines should not be underestimated. Amidst this confusion, Abaddon struck the world of Mindrad, and here is where the Battle of Mindran would occur, and it would see the Blood Angels fall beneath a tide of Khornate berserkers, personally led by Abaddon himself. The Devastator positions were overrun, the Angels' famed assault troops were repelled, and yet from the black reaches of the void, salvation came in silence. As is said in the excerpt of the Canticle of Cassandra Lev, it appears that a highly mythologized and deeply symbolic record speaks of grey-clad space marines who came out from the night, whose jagged maw did swallow the stars, and whose black gaze did mirror the void of oblivion. These figures, never formally identified, are, at least to some degree, believed by many Imperial archivists to be the Carcharodons, though no confirmation exists. As Saint Lev's records state, they fell upon the servants of the Scald One with a great fury from the darkness, unseen as the beast that lurks beneath the black waters. Death for death, blood for blood. Thus the sons of Sanguinius were brought respite. The art found on the cemetery world of Hypestus was built to honor the fallen of this campaign, and it depicts a scene in fresco and bas-relief of this incident. But the vestiges of the saviors are shrouded, obscured by black discs of obsidian, a mystery not uncommon with the Carcharodons when they are thought to be involved. Following this reprieve, the Blood Angels mounted a counteroffensive on the world of Macan. What followed was a tragedy, as nearly the entire chapter was brought to ruins at the hands of Abaddon's elite lieutenants, the Sorcerer Lord Iskandar Chiron and the swordsman Telemachon Lyras. Yet from the ashes, vengeance took form. The glorious Reclusiarch Talsterian Jaros, one of the last survivors, led his maddened death company in a final savage raid behind the enemy's lines. Unseen and unrelenting, they tore through the despoiler's honor guard, allowing Jaros to confront Abaddon in single combat. Legends say that the War Master still bears the permanent, writhing scars from this battle. Whether this is true or an embellishment, what is definitively known is that Joris and his warriors were left untouched amidst the desecrated corpses on the planet, their bodies broken and seated upon the thrones crafted from the armor of their foes. This was a final salute from Abaddon the Despoiler, a man who had not been truly injured since his battle with the legendary Sigismund, lending credence to the idea that he and this lone blood angel were a match for each other, and he bore enough respect to these Marines to never desecrate their remains, regardless of how much time has passed. In the ancient records of the Ordos Chrono, and fragmentary imperial data reels. The tail end of M37 and the onset of M38 are marked as a time of shadows and legends, lengthening across Segmentum Obscurus. Each entry in this period is a blood-stained shard, a disjointed but rather well pieced together tapestry of chaos, betrayal, and atrocity. And still at the center of his Black Legion is Abaddon the Despoiler. And so in 999 M37, the 8th Black Crusade would begin, not with a declaration of war, but rather with a ritual, executed across a dozen seemingly unconnected worlds as citizens of the Imperium vanished by the thousands in arcane blood rites dedicated to, strangely enough, Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways. The rituals themselves were mathematically precise, as the population's clusters were reduced in synchronicity, as their deaths were aligned with the celestial conjunctions known only to the warp-bound. Only after the Inquisition decrypted these macabre patterns did the broader Imperium begin to comprehend the scale of the atrocity. By then, however, death had already saturated the stars, and Abaddon's objectives, whatever they may have been, apparently were achieved, at least in part, since the Emperor still sat upon the Golden Throne. Up next would be a rather monumental occurrence. Sometime in M38, the Soul of Damnation, a derelict space hulk, drifted precariously close to the Seculus subsector's core worlds. Aboard it, the Flesh Tearer's Terminator squad uncovered something extraordinary. Within its sealed stasis vault was a warrior from the Luna Wolves, untouched since the Great Crusade. When awakened and informed of his legion's fate, the ancient marine did not mourn. He took one of the Flesh Tearer's vessels and vanished into the void. His name was never recovered, but many suspect he may quite yet play a significant role in what is to follow. On the dune-choked world of Sanjor, the Black Legion constructed a device that defied rational classification, steel framed with membranous sails of flayed human flesh, and it was set about in the warp canyons, as this obscene monument would serve as a beacon for summoning demonic entities that could now remain rather stable within the material realm. When the Cadian 232nd Expeditionary Fleet arrived, they found not a world at war, but rather one that was already devoured, teeming with demons who were feeding upon the spiritual detritus of the slain. The sands of Sanjanor were turned red and reeked with unreality. Later, in 537 M38, as a prelude to greater operations, Abaddon would initiate his 9th Black Crusade, as he struck Anticonus in order to weaken a nearby naval fortress world of Calafarius. The capital hive, Monarchive, was swiftly overrun. Black legionaries butchered through its hab layers, and the Despoiler himself led the breach into its sanctum. By the time reinforcements came from Calafarius, Abaddon had already departed and left a final insult: a dozen cyclonic warheads, which would turn the ruins of this once mighty hive into a radioactive wasteland. The 17-year-long war that followed bled worlds dry and strategically disarmed the region, allowing the Black Legion's sorcerers to enact rituals unopposed. The aim here was clear: weaken the walls of reality in this sector. Later, a ghost from the past would re-emerge. An astropathic distress signal, originating from a company of Luna Wolves lost since the Heresy, finally reached Abaddon's sorcerers. The coordinates led them to a remote world where time had distorted its identity. The Marines who awaited them had twisted their gene seed, performing crude rituals and integrating into the native societies. But what should have been a purge turned into a reunion. Rather than execute them, Abaddon welcomed the Forsaken Warriors as his kin, integrating them into his Black Legion's ever-growing tide. By 001 M39, Abaddon would unleash yet another Black Crusade. Known as the Conflict of Helica, the campaign was rather unique in its dual leadership, as this time Abaddon had to share command with the demon Primarch Pitarabo, and both would fight side by side, while the Black Legion assaulted and assailed the capital world of Trishan Primus. The Iron Warriors unleashed their wrath upon the Iron Hands chapter in a bitter reckoning. The Medusa system burned under their relentless siege. The conflict only abated when Imperial reinforcements surged to the Iron Hand's aid. Although beaten back, Abaddon and Peterabo succeeded in their secondary objective, acquiring a detailed data slate with intelligence on the Medusan's defensive archives, information that by all indications had not remained dormant. Later in M39, somewhere within the shifting madness of the Eye of Terror, the Despoiler became aware of something ancient, older than memory, adrift in unreality, as it was no mere ruin, but rather a shipyard, a veritable manufactorum of towers, and it was half submerged within the warp, rusted gantries reaching like broken fingers into the blood-red void. It was here that Abaddon beheld a relic of forgotten atrocity, an unfinished warship of planetary scale, a malevolent silhouette named by his legion seerers as Krugakalroth, or the Doom of Worlds. His warpsmiths, awestruck and murmuring incantations of binding, pledged that it would become a true planet killer, an infernal crown jewel of the Long War. It wouldn't be until 301 M39 that the 11th Black Crusade would occur. Attempting to bypass the warp storms encircling Imperial space, Abaddon consorted with a demonic guide. What followed was a disaster. His armada, lost in the imperium, only re-emerged in the path of a great wog, near the cardinal world of Relancora. There, amidst the shattered cathedrals and the burning altars, the Black Legion clashed with orcish hordes. In the months of ceaseless slaughter, the Black Legion would be pushed to the brink of annihilation, as the Despoiler was forced to choose to abandon the theater. But he would not leave empty-handed. His fleets withdrew, with their holds packed full of captured weird boys, whose volatile psychic energies were subjected to twisted rituals alongside the covens of the Black Legion sorcerers. The result of this was a wide-scale collapse in the veil of reality across the Renorum system, creating a scar on reality that has yet to fade. Later, the tragedy of Hybrossas would occur, and it began not with chaos, but rather with pride. Convinced that the planetary governor had stolen a revered relic, the chapter master of the Savage Swords ordered retribution. What followed was a spree of retributive massacres, carried out with clinical brutality. By the time the governor's dismembered corpse sat upon the throne, the truth emerged. The blade had never been taken, just misplaced within their armories. The moment of clarity, however, had come too late. The Savage Swords had already crossed the line, shedding loyalist blood in such volumes that they became ripe for Khorne's influence. When the Black Legion arrived, there was no resistance, and Abaddon did not need to conquer them. He instead welcomed these corrupted idiots. And so would come the beginnings of the Age of Apotheosis, which spanned from M40 to M42. At an unknown date in M40, Plantinos, a verdant agri-world, had existed peacefully. That is, until Glutorgra arrived. This demon prince of Nurgle, bloated with filth and rot, descended upon the world with hosts of Black Legionary at his side. The silk farms, once the pride of the planet's economy, would be reduced to charnel fields, and the demon prince devoured it all, beast, crop, and citizen alike. In its gluttony, the demon swelled grotesquely until its own bulk betrayed it. With a thunderous rapture, Glutorga exploded in a tide of bile, organs, and living corruption. From the cadaver poured a million Nurglings, cavorting through the fields of decay. The Inquisition would respond with an absolute finality, declaring the world Benditas and sealing its orbit under eternal quarantine. Later, in M40, within the labyrinthian graveyard of a forgotten crone world, Abaddon would follow the whispers of his sorcerer, Sarpathion. Beneath the ruined Wraithbone metropolis, littered with the skeletal remains of the world's dead, he discovered vast chambers shrouded in flayed skin and stitched together in vast pulsating tapestries. Upon its surface was a revelation, written in languages only known to the Warp Touch. The Penumbra prophecy laid bare the existence of 6 weapons of ancient origin, artifacts of such power that they might shift the balance of reality itself. Though the prophecy's full meaning remains cloaked in obscurity, The implications were not lost on Abaddon, nor would they be lost on the Ordo Chronos. Imperial records show that the 12th Black Crusade would initiate in 139 M41 with the Gothic War. To the Black Legion, it was the 12th Black Crusade. However, the Imperium would not see it as such. Launched deep within Segmentum Obscurus, Abaddon spearheaded a devastating assault across the Gothic sector, leveraging a dark prize that he had acquired through previous arcane plundering. 2 legendary Black Fortresses, ancient star forts of unknown Xenos origin, which had long lain dormant, now had been reawakened for a terrible purpose. Under the Despoiler's command, the fortress annihilated Trantis, a star system's heart, and with it, several Imperial worlds would be sundered. The Imperial Navy suffered mass losses in order to halt the Black Legion's advance, and though the traitors were eventually repulsed and many were slain, Abaddon himself would escape once more into the Eye of Terror with his infernal relics intact. Centuries later, one of these very fortresses would reemerge and shatter the fortress world of Cadia, so the Imperial Navy's failure to sunder it was a ghastly loss. The next event of galactic import that the Black Legion would take a part in any substantial scale would occur in 777 M41, when a sudden chaos incursion occurred within the Cadian system. The spearhead itself was once again the Black Legion. However, this time its fleet trajectory was both daring and reckless. Invaders would go on to strike deep, potentially a bit too deep, towards the heavily fortified heart of the Imperium's defenses, at a fortified orbital nucleus, later dubbed the Iron Labyrinth. The forces of the Astra Militarum, bolstered by contingents of the Imperial Fists, brought the Black Legion to heel in a punishing battle of attrition. The Chaos Fleet was then shattered and driven back into the Eye of Terror. And yet, Imperial tacticians were left uneasy. The incursion itself had cost Abaddon dearly, but to what end? What had they truly gained by pressing so far, so fast, into such an impregnable region of space? Records reveal no clear objectives and no artifacts seized, not even a single stronghold claimed. The War Master's intention, it seems, would remain unknown. Later, in M41, the trail of the Black Legion led the Imperium to the maiden world of Ilan Nidia. Here, Abaddon himself descended to claim a relic known as the Skull of Kranagur by hand, and he would be harassed for a long time by Eldar snipers from the elusive craft world of Anlotic. The Despoiler issued a single brutal order, a complete and total devastation of the world through orbital bombardment. All terrain cover around his position was reduced to scorched rubble. Despite the rapid Eldar reinforcements, Abaddon withdrew from the world with the skull in hand. Its purpose remains classified, even within the highest tiers of Imperial intel. What is known, however, is that it was not merely retrieved for display. The Black Legion would take part in another incident, loosely recognized as the Pilgrimage of Dark Lament, and this account is rather haunting, yet perplexing, as it began with a vision across countless hive chapels, manufactora, and frontier shrines. The faithful millions reported visions of the Despoiler. These were not merely hallucinations or warp bleed, as they were almost uniform in description. They spoke his name, not in hatred, but in reverence, as masses of Imperial pilgrims, numbering in the tens of millions, renounced the God Emperor and set their void ships on a course for the Eye of Terror. Starved, dying, and lost in the warp currents, only a fragment of this exodus would arrive, and what greeted them was not salvation, but rather enslavement. The Black Legion would come to chain them upon arrival, men, women, and children, yet the pilgrims wept in joy, chanting thanks to Abaddon. This case study in spiritual collapse is one of the most disturbing incidents ever logged by the Ordo Hereticus. Between 959 and 961 M41, the Paradox campaign would occur. This conflict cannot be overstated in scale or consequence, as it seemingly began as an incursion into the death world of Pythos, but in truth it was a gambit. An ancient warp portal known as the Damnation Cache lay hidden beneath the world's dense jungles, sealed since the Horus Heresy, and Abaddon knew of it. However he found out about it remains a fate few dare answer. With the Black Legion's forces supported by the Death Guard, Pythos fell in mere days. As its hive cities were razed, its planetary defense forces extinguished, and only the Catachan regiment on the planet escaped total annihilation, as they disappeared within the jungle. Abaddon began his rites to open the cache, but in response the Imperium unleashed some of its finest, the Dark Angels, led by the Supreme Grandmaster Azrael, and a strike force of the legendary Grey Knights, all of which would descend upon Pythos. In orbit, the Rock led an Imperial fleet in a void battle of epic scale, eventually breaking the Chaos blockade. But this victory rang hollow. As the Loyalists pushed into the ravaged hives, Abaddon had opened the portal, and from it, demons began to pour forth. So the very fabric of reality screamed, as psychic storms scoured entire districts. Astropathic channels fractured and rebellions ignited across the Demeter sector, fueled by a sudden violent awakening of latent psychers. Amidst this madness, a squad of Grey Knights reached the cache and were able to completely close the portal. However, the damage was already done, and Pythos was lost. Its biosphere, its cities, even the planet's very soul, was warped beyond recognition. Before departing, Abaddon abducted a rogue Psyker of immense potential, one said to be gifted with a potential with a destiny that would be pivotal in his long-awaited 13th Black Crusade. Then, in 980 M41, on Heltine, the Salamanders fought a desperate urban war against Black Legion forces. Their efforts stalled against the Demon Prince, Graxix. By 998 M41, the Black Legion had struck far from the Eye of Terror in a calculated raid, and destroyed a Prometheum refinery on the moons of Lorthanion, leaving only wreckage. What they sought or recovered remains classified by the Inquisition, meaning it's likely of high importance. Then, in the fateful year of 999 M41, the Daimor campaign erupted, as Chaos Lord Zorphas, alongside Karn the Betrayer and the Crimson Slaughter, descended upon Amathal. Though repelled by a combined force of Blood Angels and Adeptus Mechanicus, their assault cracked an ancient containment structure beneath the planet, known as the Demon Cage, and within months a nearby warp storm destabilized it completely, plunging parts of the system into empiric madness. In the closing of the 41st millennium, the Imperium of Man stood upon the brink of desolation, but few could have anticipated the scale of the catastrophe that would follow. What began as isolated acts of sorcery and war soon escalated into galaxy-shaking catastrophe. From the bleak wastelands of Fenris to the doomed skies of Cadia, the servants of the ruinous powers launched their final conclusive assault, a multi-front campaign whose reverberations still echo through the shattered Imperium. In 999 M41, the first spark of the coming storm ignited, not in open battle, but through whispers of dissent. The Changeling, a malefic servant of Tzeentch, infiltrated the Fenris system, spreading disinformation and confusion. Behind his veil of lies loomed a greater threat, Magnus the Red, demon primarch of the Thousand Suns. With an assembly of warbands and rubric marines at his command, Magnus erected a grand ritual, one that tore through the veil of the Materium and brought the demon world of Sortarius out of the Eye of Terror and into orbit above Prospero's remains. This was not merely an act of vengeance, it was a declaration. The invasion of Fenris was swift and brutal, marked by arcane warfare and a terrible majesty known as Magnus the Red. The defenders of Fenris, the Space Wolves, were caught off guard. Their ancient rival had returned, and his wrath was made manifest. This assault, though ultimately repelled, shattered the region's spiritual and strategic stability, and the timing of this assault would later raise the question: was Magnus explicitly sent by Abaddon, or did he act on his own? However, the timing of the 13th Black Crusade seemed too suspicious for it to be the latter. Between 995 and 999 M41, at the heart of the Imperium's worst nightmares stood Abaddon the Despoiler. For 10 millennia he had bided his time. 12 consecutive Black Crusades had come, and the 13th was its culmination. The gates of Cadia for millennia had been a bulwark of the Imperium, and they would be besieged by a coalition of chaos forces unmatched in their diversity or brutality. The Black Legion led the charge and was joined by ancient traitor legions, the Death Guard, the World Eaters, the Alpha Legion, the Thousand Sons, and others from the long shadow of the Heresy. They were also accompanied by uncountable warp-spawned horrors, Scarabus cultists, mutants, and the forsaken remnants of long-lost renegade chapters. Cadia held for as long as it could, but it was not the fury of blades or the wrath of bolters that ended it. Instead, it would be Abaddon's decision to desecrate the ancient pylons, Xenos constructs of unknown purpose that for 1,000 years had stabilized the region's link to real space. And once they were destroyed, the Eye of Terror began to surge outwards, as warp storms ignited across a galaxy. This was accomplished by crashing the only Blackstone fortress that Abaddon still had command of, directly into the planet, destroying both in one fell swoop, and leaving Lifthuron Blackheart as the only being with a functional Blackstone fortress at his command, potentially making him the most singularly powerful warlord amongst the Chaos Space Marines. Circa 999 M41. In the midst of this upheaval, an event of profound significance occurred. The long-thought impossible. Archmagos Belisarius Call, keeper of arcane and forbidden knowledge, emerged with a cryptic alliance forged with the Eldari faction's splinter known as the Yanari, and through a complex convergence of ancient Xenos prophecy and Adeptus Mechanicus science, the long-slumbering Primarch Reboot Guilliman was awakened upon Macragge. But this was no miracle, as an act of equal devastation would occur within the 41st millennium. Even as Reboot Guilliman drew his first breath in over 10,000 years, the Black Legion descended on Macragge in force, determined to extinguish this flicker of hope before it could spread. Unfortunately for them, Guilliman would survive, and with him, the Imperium regained its first true leader since the Scouring. But the timing of Abaddon's strike again would suggest a deeper coordination or potentially divine interference. As all this was happening, the moment that would change the galaxy would occur. As the Blackstone Fortress had been crashed into the world of Cadia, then from the Hadex anomaly in the eastern fringe to the furthest reaches of Segmentum Obscurus, reality split and tore asunder as Cadia became naught but ash. As the Cicatrix Maledictum, now known as the Great Rift, was born, a wound across the galaxy so vast and wide that it was nigh impregnable. This time would become known as the Noctis Eterna, the blackness that followed. For an unknowable amount of time, the Astronomicon itself was veiled. Warp travel became nigh impossible, a death sentence even. Communication between systems ceased, and planets were left to fend for themselves as demons flooded from the imperium at an unprecedented scale. Entire sectors disappeared, civilizations in an instant, by horrors that had waited eons for a moment just like this. Psykers across the Imperium began to lose control, triggering countless disasters as latent powers awakened with no warning. This was the closest the galaxy had ever come to repeating the Dark Age that ended with the Age of Strife. Perhaps it would have been worse. As the Imperium reeled, a pattern began to emerge, one only visible in hindsight. The invasion of Fenris, the fall of Cadia, the awakening of Guilliman, and the sundering of reality were not isolated events, but rather they were acts in a grander design. But whose design? Was it Abaddon's? A master stroke of 10,000 years of planning? Or were darker forces still at play? Entities whose comprehension defied even the most learned of the Ordo Malleus? And if it was a pattern, what would come next? As the warp storms of the Great Rift continued to expand like a malignant wound across the galaxy, entire sectors of the Imperium were engulfed in silence, madness, and ruination. Amidst this maelstrom, the Black Legion emerged once again, not in full conquest, but with acts of psychological and strategic precision that shattered morale, eroded hope, and brought entire worlds to their knees without ever requiring complete occupation. What followed are nary but 3 of these chilling engagements, moments where the ruinous powers, via the Black Legion, bled the Imperium without mercy, and left only misery and devastation in their wake. On the forge world of Raidon, a bastion of the Adeptus Mechanicus situated at the edge of the Great Rift, evacuation protocols were enacted with a grim urgency, as the planetary noosphere flickered with encrypted data streams as tech priests initiated their sacred rites to prevent their most sacred and revered archaeotech from being lost, preparing to load these relics orbital-capable frigates for extraction. But the plan never came to fruition. Without warning, an armada bearing the very livery of the Black Legion erupted from the warp, establishing a blockade that left the world sealed from the stars. Attempts to break through the encirclement failed completely and utterly. Within hours, orbital targeting platforms fell silent. Then came the bombardment, targeting Raidon's spaceports and last cannon defense arrays. The bombardment was surgical and unrelenting. As the Basilica Logiscum, the vault where the tech priests had stored their most priceless of relics, remained untouched. The Scutari stationed there to defend it never fired a shot in its defense. Instead, the Chaos forces bypassed it entirely, choosing to neutralize their mobility rather than engage in a costly siege. Once Raidon was stripped of all means of escape, the Black Legion withdrew, vanishing into the warp. Left behind were the tech priests, their relics, and the encroaching tendrils of the Great Rift. Trapped, isolated, and alone, the implications remain deeply troubling. Was this campaign of plunder denied by a greater force, or was it merely delivered to another being? Could this have potentially been a gift given to Vashtor the Archaphane in order to persuade him into working with Abaddon the Despoiler in his later campaigns? Across the bellicose stars, the Hound of Abaddon, a brutal vanguard force within the Black Legion, swept through with savage momentum, advancing until they were forced to halt at Gandor's Providence, an agri-world of limited strategic value. Gandor's Providence would seem like an unlikely place for a pitched stand, yet it became a site of a critical standoff, where the Imperial Fist, ever the bastion of fortification and defense, established an entrenched redoubts using squads of Primaris intercessors, creating overlapping kill zones across the very landscape. Rather than engage in a protracted siege, the Hounds of Abaddon withdrew. This decision, though abrupt and rather uncharacteristic, raised a series of questions. Were they avoiding unnecessary losses, or had they already achieved an unseen goal elsewhere, one that might bring another potential Chaos God to rise? Then there was the Alres system, which would become a tragic study in both human desperation and chaotic devotion. Naval resistance was fierce in this sector. However, it was short-lived. The forces of the Navis Imperialis were decimated after months of continued engagements. Retreating to Everwatch Station, a fortified orbital platform above Aralast 7, on the very surface, the Imperial Governor, Malcolm Indus, mustered what remained of his planetary defense forces in order to prepare for this final assault. But the true threat would come from within. As Black Legion warships approached, multiple Chaos cults rose from deep within the population, their devotion having festered in secret under the baleful light of the Great Rift. These cultists did not fear Chaos Space Marines. No, they worshipped them, declaring them divine messengers of salvation. Urban combat erupted throughout all of the world's hive cities as Indus was forced to turn his already depleted and dilapidated forces inwards, desperately trying to contain the insurrection before the invaders even landed. Every hour, more and more of the populace joined in the uprising as discipline crumbled. Hope ended when the Black Legion, having captured Everwatch Station days earlier, executed a final act of annihilation. The orbital platform was dislodged from its moorings and plunged towards the planet, impacting directly atop the capital hive. This destruction was total, as the city was reduced to a molten ruin, merely slag. The resulting tremors would then go on to shatter the tectonic plates and set shockwaves across continents. The surviving cultists, and there were many, took this as irrefutable proof of their divine favor. The warriors of the Black Legion were no longer mere soldiers to them, they were gods to be venerated. These accounts, grim as they are, serve as more than just simple war chronicles. They are threads in a bloody tapestry, one woven with intention, precision, and malice, and perhaps prophecy. As it seems, this was all part of a greater master plan, one where Abaddon would act with a nascent warp entity who desired to become one of the Chaos Gods, a fifth in the Pantheon. And so they would give rise to a campaign which would bring untold ruination upon multiple sectors, and even awaken a Primarch. This would become known as the Arcs of Omen.